starting off as an inspiration through speedrunning level 1-1 of Super Mario Bros. By the legendary Yuji Naka, the Sonic the Hedgehog franchise grew into a juggernaut from good times to not so good times, and it all began with its first entry on the Sega Genesis, or the Mega Drive if you're outside of North America. But being the first means it had to be put through the ringer with numerous changes including its stages, characters, physics, and even story. While there were already a good chunk of these left over in the data, a gold mine appeared in the form of a leaked prototype. And so today on Cut Content, we explored the beta unused content of the first Sonic the Hedgehog game. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and hit the notification bell too to further support us and keep creating new videos. To start things off, we'll go to the very beginning with the various conceptual designs of Sonic. This all started off with a contest that Sega held at all branches of the company in order to create a new character to compete with Mario and replace their previous mascot, Alex Kidd. And so a good deal of wonky designs came about, including an American wolf, a bulldog, a simple chick, your generic JRPG grizzled warrior, a jester-looking guy, and this odd pink bunny with shades. But eventually, the list was dwindled down to not include any of these, but rather these four, which included an odd Bart Simpson Mario fusion, cause that was truly what was hot in the 90s in America after all, a grey-looking rabbit that looked to perfectly fit into modern Sonic games even, what appears to be Dr. Eggman in pajamas and a skateboard, and of course a hedgehog known as Mr. Hedgehog. Of course, Mr. Hedgehog won, who got a cleaner art of him done afterwards and being renamed and redesigned once more into Sonic the Hedgehog as we know him today. However, some of these conceptual Sonic artworks weren't completely discarded as they were reworked into becoming the villain Dr. Robotnik, while the Grey Rabbit would later on be considered for the game Ristar, before being dropped for this star design. And the Sonic design story doesn't stop there, as beta sprites of him were found in the game with various poses, including gulping for air, holding his breath underwater, a sliding animation that was reworked into Sonic CD later, a death animation where he shrinks, another death animation where he goes black and white, likely used when falling into the lava of Marble Zone, and interestingly enough, a spin dash animation despite it not being in the first Sonic game, showcasing that they were working on the idea but dropped potentially due to time constraints. And this fun jumping animation which actually appears in a leaked prototype of the game when Sonic clears a level. But the concept doesn't stop there, as a number of characters were planned but ultimately cut. These include a band of animal friends that even feature Vector the Crocodile, that would eventually find his way into the series with Knuckles Chaotix. And in fact, a whole story was made around this merry band as the basis of the game. In addition to Robotnik kidnapping animals and locking them up, he would also be kidnapping Sonic's band members. I mean, they are animals too after all. And Sonic would have to go and rescue each and every one of them from Eggman's machines. We even have a number of storyboards made that show off this story, including the title screen transition having the band members zipping across it, a boss battle with a wrecking ball machine, and once defeated, Sonic with the same beta jumping animation appears together with his band member in celebration. And the very different final battle with Robotnik, featuring him behind a shield and using turrets, and then escaping via a plane for Sonic to destroy of course, whereby Sonic is then caught by his band member Sharp the Chicken and brought over to Green Hill Zone for him to celebrate with the rest of his band. While this was a simple story that was scrapped early on, it does make sense now why Sonic games eventually led to introduce more and more animal friends, including another animal friend that would also rescue Sonic via aircraft in the sequels. But with friends comes foes, and we get to a number of beta enemies too. We'll start off with the most famous one known as Splat the Bunny, who was a badnik who still has its sprites within the data of the game and was cut rather late in development. While not functional, the leaked prototype also contained an enemy within its debug mode of Marble Zone, where it can be placed into the level, and would have a simple hopping animation. The enemy of course finally saw the light of day with the release of Sonic Mania. As well, the enemy Ball Hog had a beta form from an early debug mode and found within the prototype data that acted very differently from its final version. In the older build of Green Hill Zone, it stood frontwards and shot bombs out of its stomach on both sides. However, in the prototype version that was leaked, he drops bombs directly below him to hit Sonic. Now I present you with this concept art of potential enemies that never made it into the final cut of the game. These include this enemy shaped like a hand with 6 fingers, this purple monster with yellow gloves, a walking cannon, possibly the only thing that kinda looks like a Batnik, a hand with bat wings which might have been the prototype version of Bat's Brain, a white baseball bat, and this giant white-looking demon or ghost. But most interestingly of all is this bee enemy that looks very much like Dr. Robotnik. Possible that they took this design and combined it with that old contender for a serious mascot to make the Dr. Robotnik that we know today. However, the sketch shows a very different looking Sonic game, even more so than the story involving Sonic's band. Now, thanks to the YouTuber Blues Genocide, who has their link to their channel in the description below, took it upon themselves to ask the character designer of the game, Naoto Oshima, via Twitter about what this artwork even was, which Naoto Oshima replied, "Why is the world of this painting a fantasy? The world of the painting is a world of nightmares." And indeed, this does look very nightmarish at that. Now, there is one more element to look at in this picture, and it's this girl here. She's Sonic's love interest. Yes, she's human. So, you guys who got angry at this human kissing Sonic in Sonic 06 should realize that this was Sonic Team's grand plan from the get-go. Her name is Madonna and was designed as a male fantasy according to Naoto Oshima, which, obviously being the 90s, was designed after a certain other pop singer of the same name. But she has several sketches that depict her with her strong interest in Sonic and showing how huge she was next to our blue friend at that. Being in that very art, it seems she might have played a damsel in distress role, much like her pink counterpart. But ultimately she was dropped due to finding her hard to market in the West and being too similar to Princess Peach of Super Mario Bros. And so it shows that Sonic went through 2 different story designs and casts before coming to the simple one that we got today. But now let's get to what many of you are here for, the levels. And thanks to the leaked prototype, the known changes are astronomical. So let's start in chronological order. Starting with Act 1 of Green Hill Zone, the basic shape of the level isn't too different. The biggest changes are these platforms that normally descend downwards aren't here. Probably put there later to avoid any leaps of faith. Other major changes include the inclusion of spikes along this wall here, which is out of place and really didn't serve any purpose considering you had no reason to head in this direction. But as for the stage itself, it has a few different placements such as the Motobug at the beginning, and the flower being of a magenta color back then. But traversing the level, a major cut element is found right off the bat, and it's this big boulder. It was found within the data of the final game too, but it's fully functional here and appropriately at this sloped ramp. If Sonic goes in front of it, it chases Sonic on the slope. If it catches Sonic, it knocks Sonic right off the level. Now this boulder is a glitchy mess too. Sonic stands on it, it floats through midair while giving Sonic a slow ride. Also, there is no checkpoint anywhere in the level, and in any of the levels of their prototype at that. So you had to beat them all in one go. Next is Act 2. The stage design is more or less exactly the same as the final games, except for the path at the end, which is slightly shorter here, which makes sense as this was added later on to give a place for Sonic to run to when he goes off screen upon completing a level. Here, when Sonic completes a level, he can stop and jump in that beta animation I showed off earlier. Otherwise, the differences are light, including the spring placements, the item placements, and the ring placements. Act 3 is where the changes are a bit more, but not too much. The big one being that they had this entire section below made in the prototype, but removed in the final game. Even with an area to land that would be impossible to get to even in the prototype considering the spikes are in the way. Otherwise, you had some shorter platforms at these top areas, making for harder platforming. More missing platforms that are supposed to lead to the next major cliff aren't there either. A missing elevator platform here too is missing. Of course, the big boulder returns to this level too, ready to push Sonic into a spiky demise. The Robotnik fight is here too, of course, but take note that this is the only boss battle made for this prototype, as any of the other levels later on don't have a single boss fight within them. Now welcome to Marble Zone, with UFOs lighting the skies of this prototype. Hard to say if this was meant to be something for a story back then, especially a nightmare story, but it's simply decoration here. As for the layout of the stage, it's basically the same shape, save for the addition at the end for Sonic to run off to. Otherwise, there is this very unique trap here. Instead of this downward spike trap, we have this sideways spike trap. It was found in the date of the final game too, but we can see it is fully functional here. Aside from that, there are a few minor changes here and there too, such as ring and enemy placement and these small spike traps being in different places. Now on to Act 2, where the first 2/3 of it are mostly the same, but the last third is completely different. Instead of having a path full of downward spike traps, you got a whole upward twirl before going down and following an upward twirl to the end. Now as for the elements of the level, the major point is this glass elevator. Normally you hit a switch to lower it, but in this, you have to repeatedly jump on it, over and over again in a slow grind to get it to the bottom. Otherwise, the minor differences are just the usual item and enemy placements. And finally, Act 3, which is even more different, with nearly the entire second half being redesigned. The second half is very interesting in that it has two paths one can choose from to get to the very end. One is a more straightforward path that is less trap-ridden but longer, while the other is a good deal shorter but very trap-ridden, with glass smashers and fire traps everywhere. And as mentioned earlier, there would be no bosses past Green Hill Zone, and it indeed is the case here too, with just a signpost available. As for the minor changes, just the usual things: repositioned traps, altered items, and even items altogether replaced by enemies, and the usual ring repositioning. Now here we are at Spring Yard Zone, or as it's called here, Sparkling Zone. And one look at the background of the stage truly makes the name make a lot of sense. Call me a city boy, but honestly, I absolutely love the background of this prototype so much. Being up close to what might be Shinjuku in design, and being so much flashier and nicer design than this distant, dark city by the mountains of the final version. Now as for Act 1, the map layout is a lot more similar this time, with the only major change being the triple loop section of the final game being a loop short here, and it being much higher up. Though this section has a whopping 4 spikes in the beta, versus the final games which only has 2. They definitely weren't kidding here. But looking at the details of the level itself, a unique trap is found at the beginning, which is a 4-way spike trap. And it definitely makes it a lot harder too, with how much room it takes up. But just below it, you'd normally have a bumper to assist Sonic to take you all the way up this giant's wall, but in the beta, there was none. And it's practically as impossible to go up here on your own. Try as I might, I just couldn't do it. Luckily, debug mode exists that let me cheat my way up there. Something that is going to become much more common at later stages of this game, considering it gets harder and harder thanks to it being an incomplete prototype here. Otherwise, the smaller changes involve a few bumper placements here and there. Act 2 now doesn't look that different at first glance, but there is one major problem, and it's missing almost all of its object placements. Yes, that means no enemies, no traps, but worst of all, most springs, bumpers, and other platforming objects are not there either, which makes this level unbeatable in this form. Otherwise, this is a very unfinished level here, which makes sense as this prototype demo actually didn't allow you to play this level like this, as well as certain other ones that we will see later on. This level in fact was only accessible via a level select menu from the title screen. And of course, we need debug mode again to even scale this level, thanks to the lack of springs and bumpers, which are needed to get to any part of this level. While I said it lacks objects, a few are still here, showing that the designs did begin here, such as the one at the very beginning, the elevators here, a few rings, and these spike balls that present as the only obstacle here. Otherwise, the other layout differences are that the beginning slightly slopes and the middle section has a bigger incline than the final games. Now, with this barren level done, we go on to another barren level called Act 3, which indeed lacks all objects, save for the single static monitor. The layout itself is fairly the same, with the beginning being a bit longer and having a small slope at the bottom of this ramp as opposed to the final game's pit, which had springs and a ledge to jump on after. But also lacking in objects means it doesn't even have a goalpost, so it's impossible to beat the level whatsoever. Now on to the watery hellscape of Labyrinth Zone. There's literally no water here! Like, not in any of these 3 acts at all. This level is automatically better in this prototype for that. But seriously though, it probably just wasn't implemented into the level yet. But starting off, let's look at Act 1. The map layout isn't too off except for the top middle section, which has this awkward and very sharp triangle cutout in the middle that can trap Sonic momentarily, while above it has a bumpier path to get through before being able to hit this tunnel. Otherwise, the level itself has a lot of cosmetic differences, such as the background, which looked more cave-like as opposed to the ruined designs of the final game. This may also explain why the prototype has no pillars too. Other cosmetic differences include crystals looking different and there being these brick-covered rooms. And of course, we have a complete absence of all objects, including the goalpost. Now Act 2 is another stage with the layout being similar except for the top center section being a bit higher, this path being open despite it leading to nothing, and the end path having a much shorter platform to scale, and for some reason that wall piece was lower too, despite it not having any uses here. Otherwise, there is not much else to say with here having no objects once more, which also means there is no water slide here either. Also, the background in comparison to before is only partially there, with no beams of light this time. I guess we're a bit deeper in the cave this time. Act 3 first and foremost has no background unlike the first 2 acts, and offers the most differences here too with its layout. The last third of the level being quite different at that. Starting with the bottom, the whole section was not used, so nothing connects to this long winding path to the split path that we have here. In fact, that long path would have been full on a dead end here, which would have been a pain after how long one has to traverse to get there. Now let's go slightly higher here to the split tunnel, which has an additional path going upwards on the left. Now this is odd as the final game had it where you'd go up the steep path to the right, which would warp you to the section on the map where you'd fight Robotnik here. Now in this prototype in this case, would the path on the left warp Sonic somewhere else? Now maybe all along that dead end from earlier led there. And it indeed does. So basically it's not too different from the final game's method of getting to this split path, but instead it goes in the other direction. Otherwise, the beginning area also experienced slight differences with there being an opening here too, and a less steep cliff. And now on to Starlight Zone, and it's practically a whole other level. Yeah, we're getting to the point where the further we get in, the more unfinished it is. Act 1 is so different here that it could have been an additional Act 4 if they really wanted to. The amount of changes are too much to list here in fact, but the stage was definitely a lot more platform heavy rather than these big blocks that were throughout the level of the final game. This being in various locations, whether at the start or up here trying to get an extra life or even crossing to get to this top area. In fact, the prototype even had falling platforms, something not in the final game. The central section was also a lot simpler too compared to the final game's crisscross of paths to get through it. And the final third is just completely different. Now, since this act was part of the demo, it does actually have objects here, and thus a goalpost does exist to complete the level. Except the goalpost is clipped lower than it normally should be. Now as for Act 2, it was not in the demo, so no more objects or goalposts. The stage layout here is even more different, and as soon as you pass the second loop, the entire stage is completely different. Again, a lot simpler than the final games. Now as for the final act of the zone, remember how crazy complex and loop-filled the final games version was? Well, the prototype sure wasn't. Aside from this big slide at the very start and the middle, it's once again a very different level, which instead of being full of loops, is full of platforming challenges again. And if I have a personal take on this, a very boring 2-ish paths compared to the 3 paths of the final game. Now on to Scrap Brain Zone, or as it was known in the prototype, Clockwork Zone. Give me a minute. Can't believe they didn't even include a W in the data. Anyways, with the entire zone not being in the demo, there are no objects first and foremost. And looking at Act 1, the layout isn't too different as the previous zones was. Some things are familiar, while most things definitely aren't. Some of these include the big triple zigzags being done in an odd way with this triangle spike that sticks into the wall, and pieced together rather messily at that. This entire platforms that are missing too, and the gap at the beginning being much further apart. And the changes keep going as so much is different actually. You also got these beta diagonal conveyor belts here too, which aren't working. Now, as you may have noticed, something is up with the background. Well, this level is using the tile sets of the level to make the background, as it definitely doesn't have a unique one yet. So it can be a bit tough to tell what's background and what's foreground here. Now with Act 2, there isn't even a background, so I'll pretend this takes place in the sky. In fact, this is the most unfinished level of the prototype, as the elevator chutes that take you to parts of the level don't even work. I almost entirely had to use the debug mode to traverse this entire level. But like the last act, the layout is familiar, but very different. There are some shapes here that are familiar, such as the zigzag path being moved up and made bigger, or the first fifth being roughly the same. Otherwise, it is very different everywhere else. In fact, there are even graphical glitches in this level, like this elevator pipe not lining up with its surroundings, and in fact spits Sonic out onto a conveyor belt. Whereas in the final game, both ends must always be elevators. Also, like the elevators, nothing works in this level. No spinning gears, no moving conveyor belts, truly an incomplete map. As for Clockwork Zone Act 3, it doesn't exist yet. With how unfinished that last level was, it's not really surprising that they haven't even begun this act yet. But if one forces this game to load it, the title screen loads for it, but it's just a blue background with nothing there yet. Now, while there is no final act in this prototype, there's one more stage we should look at, and it's the special stage. There is only one of these in this build, and it's quite simple in design actually. There are some rings here and there and very few bumpers, only 2 in fact, and it's very hard to traverse as such. The Chaos Emerald isn't present here either, instead there's a green block as a placeholder. And a number of blocks that were meant for the special zone were cut. In the final game, you only had a few. If you touched them, they would have different effects, such as reversing the camera rotation or moving the camera up and down. The ones that were found in the data of the final game include ones that show the zone's special stage that you are in, a special one that gave you 1-ups, and this mysterious W block, which the effect is currently unknown. The prototype also came with its own share of blocks, including a skull block, which may have led to the stage instantly ending or even losing a life. A magnet block, which may have had the effect of retracting rigs. And of course, a beta version of the reverse block, which reversed the camera. Now the changes don't stop with level designs, as the gameplay and the physics are also a bit different in the prototype. Sonic for one functions a bit differently. Sonic jumps a tad lower, for example, in the prototype, a whole 6 frames lower actually. His invincibility doesn't seem to extend to spikes. Combo bonuses also don't exist. You can also get an extra life with only 50 rings as opposed to 100. And the camera also is way too slow, as it can't even keep up with Sonic's speed at times. Now we got a number of unused graphics for items or abilities found in the data of the final game. Here we have 4 unused monitor boxes, the first of which is Dr. Robotnik's box. These also appear in later entries of the series, which hurt Sonic when opening it, which may have even had the same effect if it was still in the game, but they probably didn't have enough time to complete this, and it was only left like this in the final game. Next, we have this box that has a goggle symbol on it, which seems to be associated with these various graphics of goggles. It likely would have given Sonic goggles underwater when broken. In the 2013 remake of the game, this was found functional in the debug menu, and it acts like a shield but underwater. Next, we have this S monitor monitor. It does also appear in the prototype of Sonic's CD later, which grants Sonic super speed and invincibility, while the 2013 remake included this and gave Sonic the ability to go super. And lastly, the static monitor. These were common in the prototype of the game and is simply a failsafe for monitors without a proper object coding to designate what monitor box it should be. Now there are a number of graphics left over in data too, many of which are random stage chunks, effects, and pure garble. So looking at most of the prominent ones, we have these little faces and this giant swinging wrecking ball that would have hurt Sonic if he collided into it, both of which appear in Green Hill Zone. Then there is these red and yellow lights that were supposed to appear in Starlight Zone. Also this capsule piece that didn't appear in the final game. One notable effect is this warping effect, which was intended to be used when Sonic runs into a giant ring to get into the special zone. Luckily the prototype has this in somewhat of its intended form, except Sonic doesn't actually teleport anywhere when he runs through it. Also, this upside down spring, which was found in the prototype and believed to be what would have been used for the Spring Yard Zone boss fight. As well, an extra sprite exists for Robotnik's Eggmobile that shows it has longer legs. Potentially he would have jumped with this one on escape? And these sprites of Robotnik exploding in the distance probably was going to be used at the end of the game when he was trying to make his escape. As mentioned, there are also a number of less notable ones which I'll quickly flash here for you all to see. These range from effects such as explosions to switches. Now, music and sound wise, there are a ton of super slight differences here and there, and that are nearly too identical to bother showcasing, but the one that I feel is worth presenting is the ending theme, which was found in the prototype and is a tad slower. Have a listen. While we definitely explored a ton of Sonic 1's cut content through interviews, concepts, data, and even a prototype, this is not even the whole story, as we only have our hands on just one of many prototypes. There were some that were even from an earlier build that could be wildly different for all we know. If any of those ever get uncovered, I'll definitely plan to tackle those too. Otherwise, the next obvious path is Sonic the Hedgehog 2, a game I plan to cover eventually. So hit the subscribe button, for I'll plan to be back with more Sonic and other games cut content too. And hit the like button and comment below on which of these cut contents you wish would come back. So everyone, thank you for watching.